finally, a source of raw, real, and honest information on healthcare issues that matter most. Welcome to BS Free MD. From the latest medical information to how to stay sane as a doctor or a patient, no subject is taboo, no BS is allowed. Now, let's welcome your hosts, Doctors May and Tim Hindmarsh.
All right, this week we have an amazing show with an interview with Ben Westhoff, the writer of Fentanyl Inc., with an amazing story. But first, May has a word from this week's sponsor.
Yeah, if you're a physician that needs to take control of your medical billing and business systems, well, we've got a partner for you. MedEvolve can give you insights into your practice's financial performance and outcomes like never before. Get answers to important revenue questions such as, where am I losing money and why? What is the value of my AR? When will I get paid? And how many claims have not worked? When you start to think about the level of transparency you have into how your AR is being worked, that's directly proportional to your net revenue and keeping a healthy balance sheet. The right analytics solution will tell a story that's easy to understand. MedEvolve Power Analytics gives you the answers that allow you to take action. Start making healthcare business decisions based on data and learn how we're helping physician practices reduce their costs to collect and increase efficiency with data-driven technology. To have this great company help you work smarter, reduce your cost to collect, and get paid on time. Find them at drpodcastnetwork.com/MedEvolve. The link is also in the description of this show.
Okay, so we have an amazing guest today. Ben Westhoff is an award-winning investigative reporter who writes about culture, drugs, and poverty, and has advised officials at the top levels of government about the fentanyl epidemic. His previous book, Original Gangsta, is the definitive work about West Coast hip-hop. I spent about a week reading Fentanyl Inc., and it should be mandatory textbook in medical school. It was a mind blower. Just as, if you look at this third wave of the opioid epidemic, we did an episode on, overprescribing and, pain is the fifth vital sign. And then, the explosion of heroin, 10 years ago, and now fentanyl, which has become most deadly. So we'd like to welcome you, Ben. Thank you so much for joining us. It's an honor to be able to speak with you. So tell us, how did you go from rap music and your interest in rap and hip hop to the drug world? I can't imagine that there could possibly be a connection there.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. Yeah, I was a music editor living in Los Angeles, and I wrote a lot about hip hop, and I also wrote about rave culture, electronic dance music, which happens at these giant raves that were, being thrown every weekend in the greater LA area. And then someone was dying at every single one, it seemed like, sometimes 2 or 3 people. And I'd gone to raves back when I was a young buck, but I never experienced people dying. And so the deaths were always blamed on ecstasy. And from what I understood, the drug and ecstasy, MDMA, is not very likely to be deadly. It happens sometimes when you're sweaty under the sun, getting dehydrated, but this was out of hand. So I did a deep dive and found out that there was almost no pure MDMA being sold anywhere at these raves, and they were all cut with these brand new synthetic drugs, and these were all new drugs no one had ever heard of, didn't know how to pronounce their names, didn't know where they came from. And it turned out that these are called novel psychoactive substances, or NPS, and almost all of them were being made in China, all synthetic drugs made in labs. And the most dangerous of these was fentanyl. And when I started this book, I had never even heard of fentanyl. But eventually it took over the whole project, and that's how this book came to be.
What year was that when you sort of untangled it, all these deaths were occurring at these raves?
It was around the first part of the teens decade, so 2012, 2013, around there.
So when you were the young buck, that was like 2005, 2000, or early 2000s, late 90s?
Yeah, like the first wave of rave music. Since you're wearing an Iron Maiden shirt, you may not have been at these same ones.
Totally not his style of music. It was mine back in the 80s, but that was more like British, EDM type stuff.
Yeah, it came to Europe way before it got popular in the U.S.
Okay, so the wake up call for you, sort of this pivotal moment, was you'd been in this culture, you'd observed it, you'd participated in it, and then all of a sudden people are dying, and it's like, what the heck's going on?
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, people, outsiders were like, well, these are kids taking drugs. Of course they're dying, but I had a feeling there was a lot more to the story.
Okay, so then how did you like you said you'd never heard of fentanyl before you started to do the research for the book. So how did you figure out that there was like the MDMA was adulterated and that was the cause, that it was actually, not kids just all of a sudden dying from, essentially a hallucinogenic medication, but that there was these impurities?
I actually had a friend die from fentanyl in 2010, back before I'd heard of it at all. But he had a patch and was kind of overusing these prescription patches combined with alcohol. And so, as everyone knows by now, fentanyl started off as a hospital drug, but then more recently, in like the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, it's been jumped to the recreational realm in terms of these illicitly made powders from China. And so when I started looking into these adulterating drugs, at first fentanyl wasn't even the one that came up. There were all these sort of different types of amphetamines, different types of synthetic cannabinoids. You heard a lot about bath salts, quote unquote bath salts back then. And some of these were being sold legally in head shops in these really colorful packaging. They would say stuff like Scooby snacks and all that. And these weren't just these old kind of like almost inert chemicals you used to buy in head shops, like that were branded as like alternative to marijuana. I mean, these drugs really, really got you high, and were actually, people were overdosing on them, just, stuff they bought in the store. So fentanyl didn't even really come up until later, but that it was clearly the most deadly. And by the time I really even got on top of it, it was already the deadliest drug in American history on an annual basis, and that was 2016. It surpassed heroin and prescription pills, and it's gotten much worse since then.
Yeah, just as a little bit of a review. So the thing that makes fentanyl unique in the opioid world is it was the first 100% synthetic opioid, which is a huge piece to the puzzle, especially as we get into your infiltration of the Chinese drug labs. The whole, if you're going to make heroin, you need opium poppies. And, so you gotta have a farm of opium poppies. And, obviously that's tough to do. Surveillance wise, helicopters, airplanes can see what you're doing and go, okay, maybe that's why was Afghanistan sort of the cradle of growing all of these opium poppies? Because no one in Afghanistan cared if you exported opium. So fentanyl changes the game because it's synthetic. And part of the thing with it being synthetic is these analogs. Could you explain to us a bit about fentanyl analogs and the novel psychoactive substances and why this whole analog concept is such a huge deal?
Well, an analog, of course, is where you have basically the same chemical with just a slight tweak of, so the structure is almost entirely the same. But from a legal standpoint, especially in China, where these analogs were all being made, if you change the chemical structure just a tiny bit, these chemicals were now legal. And so all of these Chinese chemists were exploiting this loophole. And some of these fentanyl analogs started off as medical drugs. Some were like carfentanil, for example, is a well-known analog. It's 100 times more potent than fentanyl, and is actually used as like an elephant tranquilizer. And so you wouldn't think that this was something that a human being would want to put into their body, but it's extra profitable because just the tiniest amount can be sold for a huge markup. And so the problem with the reason that I ended up going to China was that the laws are different. In the U.S., we have what's called the what is it called? It's basically the analog law that was signed by Ronald Reagan, and it makes everything banned automatically from the moment it's created, so long as it has a similar chemical structure or a similar action to an already banned drug. So in China, this is not the case, however. In China, they have to ban all drugs one by one by one. And so that is created this recipe for this ongoing cat and mouse game that opened up this huge loophole for all these chemists to make these drugs that were just basically the same as fentanyl or even stronger, but technically legal.
I was
Go
going to
ahead,
say,
Ben.
I was fascinated by the article that you wrote about how you got interested in on this track to going to research these labs in China. And I would love it if you could sort of just share that in again for everybody, for our listeners, how you sort of got hooked up online with and connected with the people in China to going on this crazy expedition to look at one of the biggest, well, I don't know if it was the biggest, but one of the manufacturing plants over there. I mean, to me, when I read that article, I was getting sweaty palms, and it was like being taken on like a movie roller coaster. Like I was expecting like Tom Clancy and Jack Ryan and to pop out. I mean, it was crazy that you were living this adventure. And so, yeah, if you mind sharing sort of how you started researching this online and what took you over there and what happened.
Right, yeah, and I should that the article you mentioned was an excerpt from the book, and so basically when I found out about these chemicals, I just started researching them by Googling buy fentanyl in China, buy drugs in China, and it was amazing how many links popped up, and they had direct contacts, the information of all these sellers, their email addresses, their phone numbers. I started chatting with them. I made a fake identity. I said I was a drug dealer and I was interested in potentially buying these chemicals. And so I engaged with them and we had these long, wide ranging discussions, even about like how they got into this industry. Did they know what fentanyl's effects were? And eventually I said, well, I'm going to come to China. Would I be able to see your lab? And I got a number of people to agree to do that.
And when you're doing this, I guess my question, well, I was reading that. I'm like, doesn't anything pop up? Isn't there any, you hear about all this surveillance online if you're like interacting or connecting with people that are potential drug dealers online? Is there some kind of special code you use? I mean, does it set off a flag that the government's monitoring or not?
I worried about those same things, and I definitely had a lot of emails that were sort of sent to spam, and some of these sites were blocked by malware. But for the most part, no, it was surprising how easy it really was. It was all right there on Google, and some of that has changed since then. But basically these were legal drugs in China, and so for that reason, China obviously controls the internet in a big way, but these were accessible, and so I found myself on a plane to China, and I went to Wuhan. This was in 2018, so back before the pandemic, back before people had heard of Wuhan, and the thing that is maybe not coincidental is that it's a big hub for science. There's a bunch of universities there. There's tons of chemical companies. And I guess there's a conspiracy theory that coronavirus was being made in a lab or studied in a lab and it leaked out. So I'm not espousing that. But there is certainly a big subsection of the legal chemical industry devoted to making these novel psychoactive substances, these recreational chemicals, and they're often called research chemicals and other euphemisms. But as I would learn when I went to see this company in Wuhan, they know exactly what they're doing. So this company, it was called Yuan Cheng, and they specialized in fentanyl precursors. So precursors are the most important ingredients to make a drug. So, what this company did was they sell these precursors to the Mexican cartels, and the cartels just have to do this final little reaction to finish them. So that's the easiest part. And so it was all right out in the open. The salespeople told me to meet them at this hotel at this busy intersection right by the train station in Wuhan. And it turned out that they operated from inside this hotel. And they took me to their sales floor first, which had hundreds of these young salespeople who were sitting at stations in front of computers communicating with clients via social media, Skype. They were all kind of selected for their English abilities, and it looked just like a totally, like a Western corporate sales floor. And I was expecting to see guys with AK-47s guarding the door, but it was not like that at all. And so I said I was interested in these fentanyl chemicals. They also sold like steroids, the anabolic steroids. They kind of specialized in chemicals that were legal in China but illegal in the West. And these young saleswomen that gave me the tour, they were both named Amy. They shared a room. They lived in the hotel together, as everyone did, in kind of these bunks, these kind of like student housing style living. There was a chef who prepared everyone's meals in the basement. It was kind of like a really small Google campus in some ways.
Were they only selling illegal drugs for the export market, or were they selling other was this just part of their sales? Because you kind of get this Google campus, it's a pretty buttoned up business. You think of infiltrating a drug lab and you think of Narcos, and you're in the middle of the jungle and where they chop people's hands and heads off. So were they I mean, they were definitely aware that what they were exporting was illegal in the United States but still legal in China. But was that only part of their job, or was this exclusively this hotel was just the illicit export center?
No, they offered 10,000 different chemicals for sale. Now, I'm sure the vast majority of them, they never really sold much of anything, but they had these they sold Viagra, they sold fertilizers. They would really sell you any chemical you want, and they would do specialty chemicals. But it became clear from all their advertising that they specialized in these fentanyl precursors.
My question is that so you're there and they have this nice setup. It all just sounds all cool and businessy. They have to know that what they're selling that's going to Mexico is going to get turned into something that's going to be used illegally in the U.S. or other parts of the world, right? Or are they just naive and they think it's going to go to rhino tranquilizer?
Yeah, I mean, I thought they would have to know at first, but the more I learned about it, fentanyl doesn't affect China at all, really. People don't misuse it there. There's only two countries in the world that have this huge fentanyl problem, and that's the U.S. and Canada. Also, the Northern European country of Estonia has a bad problem too. But China has problems with other drugs, but most people haven't heard of fentanyl there or these other novel psychoactive substances. And so when I would talk to people about it, some of these salespeople, they would say, well, I think these chemicals can be used for lots of different things. Who knows what people use them for? And when I pushed back and I said, well, no, this is really the only thing they're used for, they said, well, we don't have this problem in China. What is this problem? And I explained it, and finally some of, one in particular, one woman said, well, I know it's a problem and I shouldn't be doing it, but I have to make a living. And this was a job that it offered good benefits. it offered this meal plan, the free room and board, which sounds a little kind of company store, maybe to us, but for a lot of young people there, it's a pretty good job offer.
But I guess where I just start, hey, this is BS free MD, and where I like my BS-ometer starts to just go to the red line, is the Chinese government obviously knows what's going on. They know, you can't have a Bible study with more than 10 people without getting thrown in jail. So how on earth, is this kind of a nod, wink, wink, we'll export some poison to, North America and, it's their problem? If the United States, I know there's a quote in your book, well, if the Americans didn't have such an appetite for opioids, they wouldn't need this.
Yeah. Well, the Chinese government is definitely a bad actor in this situation, but it's important to remember that the Chinese government isn't all one thing, right? So initially, how this all got started was China was trying to promote its exports in a big way, particularly its chemical exports. So China has the biggest chemical and pharmaceutical industry in the world. It's actually a lot bigger than the U.S. is, but they sell mostly generic drugs, and vitamins and kind of low profit margin pharmaceuticals. Whereas the U.S. makes a lot more money from our pharmaceutical industry for all these brand name drugs. So China is trying to go up the value chain, it's called. So they're trying to promote these chemicals with higher profit margins. And so fentanyl happens to be one of these. So what I found really shocking was that China has what's known as a value-added tax, and it's basically a tax rebate for the export of these different chemicals. And fentanyl is one of these chemicals where they get a tax rebate for exporting it. So I think originally this was intended to boost China's exports and make them stronger players on the pharmaceutical scene internationally. But as the fentanyl epidemic has really spiraled out of control, everybody in power by now is well aware of this, and it's shocking to me that it's allowed to continue.
Me being the conspiracy theorist sometimes, do you think that, the government there is aware of what's going on here and it's like sort of not swept under the rug, but almost they turn a blind eye to it?
There are definitely provincial leaders and people where these factories, where these companies are based, they have a strong incentive to increase exports, increase the jobs in their regions, and they are very likely to sweep all this under the rug. Now, the national leaders, they make this claim that, like you said before, that the U.S. created this problem, that they don't have this opioid crisis in China, and so we should, we need to get it under control. But also that China really has gone to great lengths to ban a lot of chemicals, sometimes even before the United Nations does. So the United Nations has its own international drug treaty, and whatever they ban, the countries that are signatories to it, including the U.S. and China, are forced to do it also. So China actually has gotten ahead of the curve on some of these drugs. The problem is just because they ban something doesn't mean it's not still getting made. And sometimes it's getting made in these same legal factories where, during the day they make something that's totally legal, and then at night the employees come back and use the same equipment to make some of these really bad recreational drugs.
I guess what, a lot of us could assume is that they have the same monitoring processes that we do here, but there's no FDA in China, is there?
Well, there is the equivalent group, and the U.S. FDA is actually supposedly allowed to do their work in China, but in practical terms, they're not. And there's been all these instances where the FDA had said they were going to do monitoring, but then they weren't allowed to, or else they have things called shadow factories, where they bring the regulators in and say, see, this is where we're doing our work. These are our chemicals. But in fact, that's a totally separate factory.
Right.
Yeah, well, I actually met a patient who was a chemical engineer that worked for the FDA, and he worked offshore. And so he would work in, like a Pfizer plant or whatever, or, one of these gigantic generic plants in India, and basically check all the drugs. And it was fascinating because I'd never heard of this before, and you just assume it's a generic drug. It goes through the FDA. It's all good to go. But this stuff's made all over the world. And his thing was, if it's made for export, it has to meet like export criteria. And, we test it. Apparently, that's at least what we think happens. But he said like he would never buy a drug, penicillin or anything that was made for domestic use in a lot of these countries where we get tons of our generics, because he said, from his perspective as a chemist, you have no idea what's in it.
Yeah, that's 100% true. When you get a piece of clothing or a children's toy, if it's made in China, it will say right on the label, made in China. But if you look at the drugs in your medicine cabinet, you're not going to have any idea where those are from. They're not required to say. And in fact, when I probe the FDA on this, a lot of times they literally don't even know themselves where these drugs originated.
Wow.
Yeah, that's
wow.
Yeah, I find it hard to believe with this. We're going on. We're almost going to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the war on drugs, which started June, officially using that terminology, June 18th, 1970. Another one of Nixon's amazing ideas. Hey, let's start the war on drugs and open up to China. Nothing bad can possibly happen. Hey, don't fake sarcasm. But anyway, so at any rate, you would think, especially with, the last administration and sort of this quasi trade war with China, that this would be, shutting down, illicit chemical export would be easy. But I guess it's not being exported to the United States. It's being exported to Mexico, correct?
Yeah, well, a lot of it is certainly coming to the U.S. too, and often directly through the mail. There's, you can order it off the dark web, fentanyl, all sorts of NPS, and there have been some crackdowns and attempts to make it so the senders on the Chinese side have to fill out more elaborate paperwork, but it's still really getting through. So yeah, it can come through the mail. It can come, but the vast majority on the streets, you're right, is coming through Mexico. And so the Mexican cartels distribute almost all of the illicit drugs that are used in the U.S. and the chemicals for meth they get from China as well, and meth and fentanyl are distributed through the same routes that are used for all these other drugs like cocaine and heroin, even marijuana still, and it's brought through the border, and that's how they all arrive here.
So tell me about this through the mail, because that was a part in the book that just really blew my mind, where it was, you used to have to go to, it's kind of the same way for all this vice, right? I mean, the internet has changed everything, right? I mean, you used to go to the seedy part of town to go to an X-rated movie, and now it's just where, it's a click away, it's on your phone. And, you used to have to go to a crummy part of town and find a drug dealer, and now you can literally get these drugs delivered straight to your house.
Yeah, the dark web is the kind of thing that it didn't seem like it could be real, because basically it scrambles the IP address of both the user and the people who are hosting these websites. And so, I spent a bit of time on the dark web when I was reporting this book. I even bought some Bitcoin, and I was all set to make a drug transaction strictly in the name of research. But at the last minute, I chickened out, and so I just held on to the Bitcoin, which ended up being a good investment. But that's neither here nor there. But yeah, these dark web sites, they will sell every drug under the sun. Some are particularly devoted to, say, psychedelics, and they kind of have an ethical component. A lot of them are like Amazon. They have user reviews. And so I'm sure you're familiar with harm reduction, this idea of trying to make drug use safer. And some harm reduction advocates actually believe that the dark web can facilitate that because, like you said, when you're going to a dark alley, you have no idea what you're going to get. But when there are user reviews, you can kind of go to the best reviewed sellers, and theoretically then you're less likely to get something that's going to poison you. So, it's obviously for a parent like myself, this is sort of the worst nightmare, this idea that our kids could just order this to our front door. And fentanyl is 50 times more potent than heroin, and so it takes very little. It's a tiny little plastic bag could have a year's supply. 2 grains of rice worth is enough to overdose, and that makes it a much more easy to facilitate through the mail.
I guess my thing too is, how do you trust the reviews? How do you know that they're just not all bought or made up? I mean, that's just a whole other topic, I suppose, but I read reviews for stuff online, whether it's makeup or food, and on Instagram, and I start to get really suspicious that, it's just a bunch of bottom reviews. So I guess, how would we trust, if you're going to think about the legalization of drugs, and that you can trust these dark web reviews for it to be safer?
Well, I think it's like anything else. You can kind of go with your gut, and when you see someone has a lot of sort of activity and the reviews seem to be genuine, maybe you could. I mean, it's not something that I do, but I'm guessing that these sites go out of their way to really try to build that trust how they can.
Crazy. I mean,
right. Well, then there was the whole concept of the psychonauts, the people that especially are into the psychedelics, and because the novel psychoactive substances aren't tested on people. LSD was tested extensively on people, not necessarily with their consent, but it was tested. So we had a clue that it would do, send you on a trip and, was probably not lethal, et cetera, et cetera. But, these drugs, you make an analog of LSD or an analog of MDMA, and it could be poison, and you don't know because it's never, gone through animal studies or anything else.
Exactly, and that is the NPS revolution has changed the drug landscape, so it's unrecognizable from even a few years ago. So, back I was born in 1977, and most drugs were plant-based. There was LSD, MDMA had not even come onto the scene really, but starting, maybe about 10 years ago, you started to see all these different analogs, and a lot of them were taken from medical studies. And this also rose because of, like you were talking about, the rise of the internet. So whereas before all of these medical studies, these academic studies on new drugs were kind of buried in dusty university libraries, now all these studies were put onto the internet. And so these kind of rogue chemists could just sort of scroll through there and look at these new chemicals and say, hey, maybe that can get you high, and would start making it. And so you had a situation where there were maybe like 100 new synthetic chemicals for the first 5 or 10 years, and then it got to be so now there's like 100 new drugs every year. And like you're saying, the vast majority of these, not only is there no sort of formal studies on them, but there's almost nobody in the world has tried them. And these psychonauts, like you talk about, are people who specialize in taking brand new chemicals. They're like human guinea pigs who try these drugs for the first time. They write about their experiences, usually while they're still high, and they recommend them to other people or tell them to stay away.
Or not.
So it's like dark web Leafly.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, for people that Leafly is essentially, if you live in an illegal state, it's essentially the periodic table of weed. And the reviews are amazing because usually people write them high, and you can almost hear like Doritos crunching in the background whilst they're writing some of these reviews.
It is, crazy.
But so that's.
I guess I want to hear the end of the story about when you were in China I read the that script, but for the rest of the people listening, so at no point did you start to feel really nervous, uncomfortable, like this is living on the edge? They might figure out that you're not really a buyer, or that something horrible might happen, like literally like Pablo Escobar's guys might come in.
All right, so that's the end of the first half of our interview with Ben Westhoff, the author of Fentanyl Inc. I highly recommend that anyone the least bit interested in this should check it out. Like I said, it really should be mandatory reading in medical schools everywhere, really, especially in Canada and the United States, where we have a huge problem with this. So next week, we're going to continue on discussing his adventures in China, and then move on to, hey, is there anywhere that this is not happening? Are there countries that have reversed their opioid problem? Are there ways to do this that are different than what we're doing now with the war on drugs that may be more effective? So tune in next week for the rest of the Ben Westhoff interview. I guarantee you it's just as good as the first half.
All right, and then before we go, remember, don't forget to reach out to MedEvolve. For those of you who know how hard it is to build and maintain a sustainable business, they understand that bringing the right solutions to achieve your goals is key. So go to www.drpodcastnetwork.com/medevolve and get on the path to transparency, automation, and accountability in your revenue cycle.
Fantastic. So we'll see you all next Thursday for the second half of the Ben Westhoff interview. Highly recommended. And again, have a great week. And, maybe don't stay safe. Maybe have a little bit of adventure in your life for a change, because I'm really tired of hearing stay safe. And if you know anything about my lifestyle, it's not my way. So we'll see you all next week.
Bye.
It's no secret that medicine is a bit, uptight. That's why Tim and I created BS Free MD, to mix things up a little and have fun in the process. Besides, we are having these exact same discussions all the time, so we thought we might as well invite everyone to the party. If you really like us, you can get plenty more, and maybe see one of Tim's cool tattoos on our Instagram or Facebook pages at BS Free MD. See you next time.
Well, we try to keep BS Free MD as raw and real as possible. We can't be held responsible for any medical decisions or discussions had as a result of what you've heard on the show. We know, bummer. But the truth is, we really do care about your questions. So feel free to reach out to us by email at doc@bsfreemd.com.